Random House Audio presents The Next Decade, Where We've Been and Where We're Going, by George Friedman. Read for you by Bruce Turk. Author's Note: This book is about the relation between empire, republic, and the exercise of power in the next 10 years. It is a more personal book than the next 100 years, because I am addressing my greatest concern, which is that the power of the United States in the world will undermine the Republic. I am not someone who shuns power. I understand that without power there can be no Republic. But the question I raise is how the United States should behave in the world while exercising its power, and preserve the Republic at the same time. I invite readers to consider two themes. The first is the concept of the unintended empire. I argue that the United States has become an empire not because it intended to, but because history has worked out that way. The issue of whether the United States should be an empire is meaningless. It is an empire. The second theme, therefore, is about managing the empire, and for me, the most important question behind that is whether the Republic can survive. The United States was founded against British imperialism. It is ironic and in many ways appalling that what the founders gave us now faces this dilemma. There might have been exits from this fate, but these exits were not likely. Nations become what they are through the constraints of history, and history has very little sentimentality when it comes to ideology or preferences. We are what we are. It is not clear to me whether the Republic can withstand the pressure of the empire, or whether America can survive a mismanaged empire. Put differently, can the management of an empire be made compatible with the requirements of a republic? This is genuinely unclear to me. I know the United States will be a powerful force in the world during this next decade, and for this next century for that matter, but I don't know what sort of regime it will have. I passionately favor a republic. Justice may not be what history cares about, but it is what I care about. I have spent a great deal of time thinking about the relationship between empire and republic, and the only conclusion I have reached is that if the republic is to survive, the single institution that can save it is the presidency. That is an odd thing to say, given that the presidency is in many ways the most imperial of our institutions. It is the single institution embodied by a single person. Yet at the same time, it is the most democratic, as the presidency is the only office for which the people as a whole select a single, powerful leader. In order to understand this office, I look at three presidents who defined American greatness. The first is Abraham Lincoln, who saved the Republic. The second is Franklin Roosevelt, who gave the United States the world's oceans. The third is Ronald Reagan, who undermined the Soviet Union and set the stage for empire. Each of them was a profoundly moral man, who was prepared to lie, violate the law, and betray principle in order to achieve those ends. They embody the paradox of what I call the Machiavellian presidency, an institution that, at its best, reconciles duplicity and righteousness in order to redeem the promise of America. I do not think being just is a simple thing, nor that power is simply the embodiment of good intention. The theme of this book, applied to the regions of the world, is that justice comes from power, and power is only possible from a degree of ruthlessness most of us can't abide. The tragedy of political life is the conflict between the limit of good intentions and the necessity of power. At times this produces goodness. It did in the case of Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Reagan, but there is no assurance of this in the future. It requires greatness. Geopolitics describes what happens to nations, but it says little about the kinds of regimes nations will have. I am convinced that unless we understand the nature of power and master the art of ruling, we may not be able to choose the direction of our regime. Therefore, there is nothing contradictory in saying that the United States will dominate the next century, yet may still lose the soul of its republic. I hope not, as I have children, and now grandchildren, and I am not convinced that empire is worth the price of the republic. I am also certain that history does not care what I or others think. This book, therefore, will look at the issues, opportunities, and inherent challenges of the next 10 years. Surprise alliances will be formed, unexpected tensions will develop, and economic tides will rise and fall. Not surprisingly, how the United States, particularly the American president, approaches these events will guide the health or deterioration of the Republic. An interesting decade lies ahead. Introduction. Rebalancing America. A century is about events. A decade is about people. I wrote The Next 100 Years to explore the impersonal forces that shape history in the long run. But human beings don't live in the long run. We live in the much shorter span in which our lives are shaped not so much by vast historical trends, but by the specific decisions of specific individuals. This book is about the short run of the next 10 years, the specific realities to be faced, and the specific decisions to be made, and the likely consequences of those decisions. Most people think that the longer the time frame, the more unpredictable the future. I take the opposite view. Individual actions are the hardest thing to predict. In the course of a century, so many individual decisions are made that no single one of them is ever critical. Each decision is lost in the torrent of judgments that make up a century. But in the shorter time frame of a decade, individual decisions made by individual people, particularly those with political power, can matter enormously. What I wrote in The Next 100 Years is the frame for understanding this decade. But it is only the frame. Forecasting a century is the art of recognizing the impossible, then eliminating from consideration all the events that, at least logically, aren't going to happen. The reason is, as Sherlock Holmes put it, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is always possible that a leader will do something unexpectedly foolish or brilliant, which is why forecasting is best left to the long run, the span over which individual decisions don't carry so much weight. But having forecast for the long run, you can reel back your scenario and try to see how it plays out in, say, a decade. What makes this time frame interesting is that it is sufficiently long for the larger, impersonal forces to be at play, but short enough for the individual decisions of individual leaders to skew outcomes that otherwise might seem inevitable. A decade is the point at which history and statesmanship meet, and a span in which policies still matter. I am not normally someone who gets involved in policy debates. I am more interested in what will happen than in what I want to see happen. But within the span of a decade, events that may not matter in the long run may still affect us personally and deeply. They also can have real meaning in defining which path we take into the future. This book is therefore both a forecast and a discussion of the policies that ought to be followed. We begin with the United States for the same reason that a study of 1910 would have to begin with Britain. Whatever the future might hold, the global system today pivots around the United States, just as Britain was the pivotal point in the years leading up to World War I. In The Next 100 Years, I wrote about the long-term power of the United States. In this book, I have to write about American weaknesses, which, I think, are not problems in the long run. Time will take care of most of these. But because you and I don't live in the long run, For us, these problems are very real. Most are rooted in...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?